Yesterday morning, I was sitting in a chair on the hollowed lawn at UVA with thousands of other parents and other relatives and friends, including Laura Codrus, watching my younger daughter Martha graduate from that university, which has done so much to shape and change her over the past 4 years. Seeing those black gown graduates walk down the lawn or skip down the lawn or gamble down the lawn, a parade of various helium balloons and colorful stoles and decorated caps, hearing the speeches and just plain taking in the pomp and circumstance of it all transported me to other times of transition in my life, including my own graduations. These were moments where I could feel that things would no longer be quite the same. Times when I knew I truly was moving into a new chapter of life and leaving something and some people behind, at least physically, if not psychically and emotionally. We've all had those moments, whether they were commencement ceremonies or weddings, memorial services, or the tearful goodbye shared when we moved to a new city or a new job opportunity. Moving from the house you lived in for 30 years into assisted living or a smaller apartment qualifies. So does saying farewell to a friend or a mentor. After the big graduation exercises, the mass of people on the lawn dispersed and moved to different locations across the grounds of UVA for the departmental graduation ceremonies. Here is where the graduates have their chance to have their names called and walk across the stage. So our family moved on over to the McIntyre Amphitheater, where the English department would be acknowledging their graduates. We were right up close, so we could see the graduates walk by in their caps and gowns. We could also see what the professors were wearing. I couldn't help but notice that affixed to many of their gowns was a button with the letters SYD, Sid. This is the way that Sydney Blair's students and her colleagues had of honoring her life. Sydney was my daughter's advisor who died suddenly this past December. The button symbolized that Dr. Blair, though she had passed from this life to the next, was still very present yesterday, and that she lived on in her students and in her colleagues in some way through the impact her life had on theirs, the people that she taught and taught alongside. Jesus' farewell discourse to the disciples in the Gospel of John, that long monologue the author of John gives him as sort of a last lecture to his followers before his crucifixion, returns again and again to the idea that when he leaves them, he is entrusting them with the work that he began. But he also lets them know that they will not be alone when they do that work. Somehow, some way, he will be in them and with them in the presence of what he calls the advocate, the Spirit of truth, the Spirit of love, that he says the world cannot receive. That Spirit, he says, will abide in them and be in them. They will not be left comfortless as if they were orphaned. It's one thing to hear words like that in times of transition, and quite another to really trust them, which may be why Jesus seems to go on and on and on, reiterating his few points again and again in his discourse in the upper room. My commandment is this: love one another as I have loved you. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. They who keep my commandments are the ones who love me. And if you keep my commandments, the advocate, the Spirit of truth, will abide with you and be in you. And he says it again and again throughout that discourse. I can almost hear the disciples saying, okay, we've got it. Enough. But it's one thing to hear that you will not be left alone at a time of transition, and quite another to trust that. It's one thing to hear that you're called to love God and each other and yourself and your enemies and the people that nobody else seems to take the time to love, and the ones who are marginalized and mistreated and the ones who are at risk, and quite another to actually love and stand for them. It's one thing to hear the work of your teacher or teachers confidence they placed in you will be carried on in how you live and love and create and serve, and quite another to actually live as if that were true. Especially when the circumstances of life and the larger world around us can seem so darn challenging. There's not one person here among us who isn't unsettled when we watch or read the news. We wake up one day and maybe we realize that it's been days or maybe even weeks since we've really prayed. We notice ourselves more and more giving in to feelings of animosity towards others or despair at the plight of the world, rather than letting God's Spirit guide us in faith and hope and love. Do you know what that feels like? Maybe it's just me. This is why the sermon is entitled Longing for the Spirit of Truth, instead of possessing it. Because first of all, the Spirit isn't something that you possess, it's something that possesses you. And secondly, because part of growing as followers of Jesus is really recognizing that we need God's help. We don't always admit that. Because, well, what Paul said to the Athenians about the God we know in Jesus Christ is true. In Him we live and move and have our being. And there are times when I, at least, and I hope you too, feel like God is really as near as our next breath. There are also times when maybe, just maybe, we feel the tiniest bit cut off from God. There are times when I feel so assured of God's presence that I'm almost literally walking on air. And other times when I'm reminded of the singer David Bailey's lyric, if God seems far away, guess who moved? We live and move and have our being in God. The Spirit of Jesus really does live in us, but we aren't always in touch with that. After all, how in touch with the Spirit can you really be if you're actively hating your neighbor or even resenting her or simply ignoring her? How in touch with the Spirit can you be if you are resisting relationship with God or simply not putting any time into it? How in touch with the Spirit can you be if you're doing things that are really harmful to yourself? This is why Jesus returns again and again in John's depiction of his farewell discourse to the commandment to love. Love each other as I have loved you. They'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. They'll know we are Christians by what? By our love. You may have noticed that the passage I read from John was framed by the words commandments and love. Keeping Jesus' commandments to love is how we experience our connection to the Spirit. So a few more stories from yesterday. The first is the chance I had to hear the commencement speaker for the day. Her name is Deborah McDowell, Dr. Deborah McDowell, and she is the Alice Griffin Professor of English and the director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute of African and African American Studies at UVA. She's been at UVA for 30 years. She herself is African American. In her commencement speech, she challenged the graduates with the words of Martin Luther King Jr. from his 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. She quoted King, "Courage is an inner resolution to go forward despite obstacles. Cowardice is submissive surrender to circumstances. Courage breeds creativity. Cowardice represses fear and is mastered by it. Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expedience asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right?" There comes a time, King said, we must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but one must take it because it's right. That's how she challenged the students at UVA yesterday. And there are all kinds of times in life, not just big momentous times, but all kinds of times in life. And we're called to take positions and act in ways because they're right. not because they're safe, because they're popular, because they're expedient. Sometimes acting in love is very simple, very, very simple. And it doesn't take a whole lot of courage. Other times, a lot of other times, love is costly, and it requires more courage, far more courage, than we can muster without help from beyond us. So a final story about yesterday. I'm going to try to tell it without tearing up. After the English graduation ceremony, we were all invited to attend a reception. Martha asked us to do that so that we could meet and talk to a number of her professors and so that she could say goodbye to them. The professors all told us how marvelous Martha was, and I hope she doesn't mind that I'm sharing that with you. We went to the reception and spent some time talking to students and teachers. One of her professors, who she really wanted to introduce us to, is a man named John Casey. He'd left that reception and gone on to one for the master's graduates. So we hightailed it from the reception where we were with the BA students to get to the master's students reception. And when we arrived at that reception, which was in Bryan Hall, one of the professors there at that reception told us that John had already left. Martha was disappointed. John is older, nearing and actually perhaps beyond retirement age. She really wanted us to have a chance to talk to John. That second reception, as I said, was in Bryan Hall, where many of the English faculty have their offices. Along the hall where the reception was held were doors to each of their offices, and I watched my daughter walk down that hall. And at several doors, she put her hand on the nameplate of the professor. There's one door there that no longer had a nameplate. She touched it. She lingered over it. And as I watched her, I thought to myself, God, I hope that Martha knows. Sydney's spirit abides in her. I hope we all know that Jesus' spirit abides in us. When we don't feel that connection or trust that presence, maybe we need to come back here and touch the nameplate again. Maybe it's time to get in touch with our longing. Longing like someone who feels like they're a motherless child. What that spirit will do, that spirit that we long for, that spirit that was in Jesus and in us, what that spirit will do is it will bring us comfort, and it will bring us challenge, and it will